Okay, we're live. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. We'll just give it a couple of minutes before we start. We'll be waiting for a few more attendees to join in. Just bear with us, please. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll just give it one more minute to have people join us, and then we'll begin. Thank you. All right. Thank you for joining us as we start the webinar on global perspectives on child sexual abuse. Very pleased that Arpan and Together for Girls has come together to organize this webinar and have experts join in from different parts of the world to look at the issue, discuss trends, what are the challenges, and I'm sure it'll be an enriching experience for all of us. Our moderator for today is Daniela Ligiero. Dr. Daniela is the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of Together for Girls, a global public-private partnership dedicated to ending violence against children, especially sexual violence. The partnership includes 5 UN agencies, the governments of the United States and Canada, several private sector organizations, and more than 20 country governments in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, working together to generate comprehensive data and solutions to this public health and human rights epidemic. Dr. Ligiero has held positions in UNICEF, the World Bank, the UN Foundation, and the US Department of State. She's also a survivor of sexual violence in childhood herself and has been speaking publicly about her story for over a decade. Daniela, over to you.
Pooja, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with you here today, and we're really delighted to be partnering with Arpan for this really important conversation. And I want to start by just commending you on all the work that Arpan has done, and really this idea of Child Safety Week, a whole week where everyone's engaged in thinking about how do we prevent and respond to child sexual abuse, an issue that unfortunately happens everywhere in the world. And so really exciting to be with this amazing group of human beings, friends and colleagues who are in each of their own countries, spaces, working to make sure that children don't have to go through this experience, and making sure that those who have the support, care, and healing that they need. So the idea today is just to have a conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm going to start by introducing our awesome panel. Thank you, Pooja, for introducing me. let me start with introducing Dr. Louise Engelbrecht. She has 3 degrees in social work. She was born and brought up in India, and she has worked extensively on the issue of child sexual abuse in Asian countries, especially working with community workers in the area of prevention and treatment of child sexual abuse. Her expertise is project development, and she has been part of developing new programs in Malaysia, China, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, and India. She is the founder of the Center for Prevention and Treatment of Child Sexual Abuse in Quezon City, and her work has been translated into Hindi, Tamil, Bahasa Malay, Tagalog, Arabic, Chinese, and Vietnamese. Lois, it's so good to have you with us today. Caitlin Brewer is a high energy, and I can attest to that, entrepreneurial executive, and she's passionate about empowering people, organizations, and communities to enhance the impact of social movements. She's the president and CEO of Darkness to Light, the US's leading advocate for the prevention of child sexual abuse, and her expertise in transforming organizational cultures, achieving programmatic scale, and implementing behavior change communication has really been leading insights and helping to really stir the conversation and advance the conversation around child protection and adult responsibility in child protection in the US in really meaningful ways. Since 2016, Caitlin's leadership has resulted in exponential growth in programmatic research and increased standing as a chief influencer in the space of child safety. Through education, advocacy, and research, Darkness to Light continues to revolutionize the way societies keep children safe from abuse. Welcome, Caitlin. It's so good to have you with us. And sorry, I keep looking away because I have this other screen where I'm reading off, and then I will pay 100% attention to you all here. Next, we have Donald Finlater, who is the Director of Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Helpline, Stop It Now UK in Ireland, a project of the UK-based child protection charity, the Lucy Faithful Foundation. Following a career in the UK Probation Service, designing and delivering sex offender treatment programs, Donald joined LFF to set up the Wolvercote Clinic, a residential assessment and treatment center for sexual abuse predators. Since establishing Stop It Now in the UK in 2002, he has engineered a number of child sexual abuse prevention initiatives, including ECSA, a knowledge exchange project that supports agencies and individuals across the globe to design and implement evidence-based child sexual abuse prevention strategies. Welcome, Donald. So good to have you with us today from the UK. And finally, someone who I probably needs no introduction for this crowd, but the amazing Pooja Taparia, who is the founder and chief executive of Arpan, India's largest NGO addressing child sexual abuse. Arpan key project focuses on personal safety education in schools, along with training and empowering teachers and parents with the knowledge, attitudes, and skills needed to prevent and deal with CSA, child sexual abuse. As a critical stakeholder for state and non-state actors, Arpan is a leading voice in the space of CSA prevention and intervention in India, and uses advocacy and research to push for policy and systemic change at the local, state, and national levels. Since 2007, Arpan has impacted 1.6 million children and adults through its CSA prevention and intervention services. So, all of that to say that we just have a really phenomenal panel of, again, experts, but also human beings who are really at the forefront of prevention and response for child sexual abuse. And I'm delighted to be here with you today. So to get us started, I want to throw out a first question. And it really is, I think, as we're thinking about where we need to go next and what we need to do to continue to deal with this problem that, again, affects every single country in the world. And at Together for Girls, as Pooja mentioned, one of the main things we do is these national household surveys that give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And at this point, with data for over 10% of the world's population under 24 that we have through these surveys, we know, as well as through additional data, that millions of children everywhere, boys and girls, experience child sexual abuse every year. anywhere from, 8 to 30% of kids, depending on the country, are experiencing this, that we know of, and that's underreported. So, it is a massive problem. It's happening everywhere. And before we can think about what do we need to do to move forward, it's important to look at the gains we've had to date. Like, what is the progress that we have made to date? So my first question for the panel is really around, from your perspective, if you look at the last decade, what are some key areas where we've really made some progress when it comes to prevention and response to child sexual abuse? And why don't we start with you, Pooja, and then go around and hear from other panelists. Thanks so much. You're muted, Pooja.
What I see in India are two, three things primarily. One, what I see in the last decade of work that we've been doing is greater acceptability and acknowledgement of the issue amongst parents, educators, individuals. I also see more acknowledgement amongst the government bureaucrats, and that there is a need to address the issue, which was missing earlier. So I think that is one key change that I see, and some progress that we've made with continuous awareness and training and advocacy work. The second thing that I see is Arpan's, as you know, we have a school-based prevention and intervention model. I'm very pleased to say that years and years of work, we've been able to develop an effective school-based prevention and intervention model. And, Dr. Engelbrecht has been, or actually, let me call her just Lois. So Lois has been, has played a very key role in that. She's helped us think through that in the earlier years, and then we went and piloted and reviewed it and done a number of evaluations to see that it is effective. And so I feel pleased that years of work, a decade of work, there's solutions, models that work, and now we're ready to scale even more. And I think the third thing that I see in India that has helped the issue is having a separate legislation on the issue of child sexual abuse, something which was missing before the year 2012. So it's 8 years now. We have a very robust legislation that's been brought in, and I see increased reporting and increased dialogue on the issue post that. So these would be my three key changes and progress that I see.
Thank you, Pooja. And I see we already have a question in the Q&A. I failed to mention this, but the hope is that we're going to have some period of time where I'm going to be asking questions of the panelists, but then we'll leave the last 20 minutes to half hour for questions from the audience. So feel free to put your questions in as they come up so we can keep track of them in the Q&A, and that's what we'll be using, not the chat, the Q&A. Thanks, Pooja. Why don't we go over, since she did mention you, Lois, why don't we jump over and hear a little bit from you in terms of your perspective on this?
I want to focus on the Philippines because that's where most of my work is. And for me, our progress has been mostly taking the concept of child sex abuse away from exploitation. We're a poor country. Well, we weren't so poor until Marcos came. We're a poor country. We've been led by the West for 700 years. And we have this chip on our shoulder. So all child abuse was for a long time, and the legal thing was on exploitation, how foreigners come and exploit us. But what we've been able to see is this really good change, legally as well as socially, understanding that we are the ones offending each other. Yes, exploitation is there, but number one, exploitation is facilitated by us. And our children are being hurt more by people that they know and love. So that, and legally. But the other big change is our work with boys. And I really want to, I'm going to focus a lot on our work with boys because we also have a Child Safety Week. We don't call it Child Safety Week. And Donald Finlater is going to be a part of that, where we're focusing on boys. because when you look at our laws don't even cover boys. The assumption is that the victim is the girl and the offender is a boy. So even when you say what is rape, rape is the penis touching the vagina or inserting the vagina, but nothing about how a boy can be raped, how a boy is offended. So for me, the biggest change, the biggest advance that we are seeing is our work understanding boys can be victims. And then of course, how to help boys in general, because most prisons are filled with far more men than women. So what is it that is leading these boys into jail? Never mind just the sex abuse. So those are the two things: taking it away from exploitation, accepting that the problem is ours, and then looking at what we do with our boys. How do we bring up our boys?
Such a good point, Lois. Just to jump in here, one of the things for us as an organization, we were called together for girls, and we started really looking at this issue among girls. But throughout the years, the data are just so strong around the percentage of boys that experience child sexual abuse. So we've had to rethink, at this point, we have a whole new program called Together for Girls for Boys, but I think the data are pretty clear on those numbers. And interesting that I think as a field, I think not only the Philippines, but many countries are still kind of catching up to that idea.
But just to add on this one, I presented this in Ghana. There were several African country professionals who came up to me and said, we're also seeing that, but we don't even want to tell anyone because we don't think anyone will believe us. So thanks for going for that there.
Yeah, a lot of barriers to break there. Caitlin, let's go over to you in the US.
Thanks, Daniela. Yeah, in the US, I think over the last 10 years, we have seen a complete shift in how the media covers this topic. We've had a number of really high profile cases in the US. Jerry Sandusky, we've had the Larry Nassar trial with the US Olympic gymnasts. And so the average everyday person who maybe had never understood the prolific nature and the prevalence of child sexual abuse is starting to read about this in the newspaper, every day. And so we've seen at Darkness to Light an uptick in individuals curious about information and looking to us for guidance on how they can advocate for both the survivors in their lives that they know that they didn't understand sort of how that affected the survivors in their lives, as well as from a legislative perspective. It's been really interesting to sort of see how our government has rallied around in a nonpartisan way, and we're in a very partisan era in our country. That we're making sure that we're able to advocate for better education, better, access to services with child advocacy centers. So I have seen a complete overhaul. And I know we're going to get to the challenges, but coupled with that is a lack of funding sort of associated with that. So the progress we're making on the legislative side, we still need to get to that place where the money is funding some of the efforts that we're looking for. And the final thing I'll say is the Me Too movement, really has sort of taken shape here in the United States. While the Me Too movement really does focus on adult survivors and adult sexual assault, particularly in the workplace, there is a place for children in that conversation, and the Me Too movement has recognized that. And so it's allowed a lot of people to feel much more comfortable talking about their own personal experiences. And so when people understand their proximity to the issue, then they're willing to sort of hear what some of the problems are and what some of the solutions could be. So.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Caitlin. In fact, scandals in newspapers, it feels like in the US, but all over the world, there's more and more coming out, which can be really good in terms of uncovering what's been there all along, right? It's not that there's more happening, it's just that we're seeing it more, yeah. Donald, over to you in the UK.
Goodness, how do I follow what's been said so far? Look, for me, though, there has been an awakening of a broader understanding. And I guess maybe I can bring an example from our shared global experience of COVID. With COVID, I think there's been a recognition that we're all in this together, that the solution has to involve every member of society. And yes, there's things we need to do with those who experience it, to look after them as best we can, to make sure the best resources go there so that they don't impact other people. But that I have to wear a mask, I have to social distance, I wash my hands, as does my wife, as does my family, as does my neighbour, that they are part of the solution to the problem of COVID. While scientists craft vaccines and various other things, and medicines do all sorts of remarkable things for us all. Well, if we took child sexual abuse on the same basis, we have to all be in this. And this is the thing that I think is shifting, is an acceptance this is a public health problem that therefore needs all of us to be part of the solution. And there are different bits that are the solution, but no one bit fixes it. We have to provide good treatment for those who are impacted by abuse as victims. I would tell you, from where I come, I also want to provide good treatment for those who do the abusing so they don't do it some more. But more than that, we need to do the work upstream, the hand washing, the social distancing. How do we educate everyone so they know the signs and they're taking action today that reduce the likelihood of someone else behaving badly or being victimized? And I think if we have a shared kind of language about child sexual abuse and its prevention, then I think that for me is one thing that we have been striving for. And for me, it was the work of Stephen Smallbone, Richard Wortley, and Bill Marshall back in 2008, articulating a child sexual abuse public health model of prevention, and that I've then seen outworked in various other places, because we need a shared language to talk in effective ways about prevention and all the raft of things we need to do, because no one thing will fix this, but a number of things working wisely in combination can do remarkable things. And that's where I think we've been traveling. We've got a way to go. I'm not pretending we're out of the woods here, but I think we've got a good basis for starting from here.
Yeah, that's amazing, Donald. You know, it reminds me, this is something I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, it almost feels like, you know, several decades ago, we started from a place where this doesn't even happen. Like, there was so much denial around it, right? And over time, it's like we've been able, there's data and there's, you know, things you read in the newspaper and more coming out around the magnitude and the severity of the problem. And that's been really important. And now we're on this journey where it's like, okay, there's a problem, it's really bad, but it doesn't have to be this way. There actually are things that can be done, solutions, et cetera. And everyone has a role to play, right? So it's not on other people. So it's almost like a journey I think the field has been on, that I'm hearing from all of you, that I think is really important to understand, because that's where we get to ending this. Yeah, Caitlin, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something that Lois said in terms of separating exploitation from child sexual abuse and sort of the othering of child sexual abuse. I think what we've seen, again, and I talk about that proximity, you know, people aren't allowed to sort of say, oh, well, that's a Catholic problem. Oh, well, that's a Jewish problem. That it's coming out in all communities now. And so you can't other child sexual abuse. You can't say, oh, well, just, you know, children from a certain country are trafficked. Like, people are being trafficked in the United States, and we're talking about domestic exploitation now in a way that we weren't before. And I think, you know, previously people would say, oh, that's so horrible that that happens in other communities. And now people are really having to reconcile with the fact that it happens in their community, and that it's typically someone that they know and trust. And so there's still a journey that's happening on that. But I think these stories and the exposure that this conversation is getting is helping people remove that barrier of the other.
Well, barriers is the right word. Let's move into that a little bit. So there's been some progress. There's some areas that still need work. I'd love to hear a little bit more from the panel about what are those challenges? What do you see as the most important challenges ahead for us in our own countries, in our own work, but as a global community? And what are the ways in which we overcome those challenges? So Why don't I throw it back to, yeah, Caitlin, you were just speaking. Take it away. Keep going.
So the challenges, unfortunately, are great. You know, we're dealing with a lack of funding. We'll just start, you know, sort of at a place that's a pain point for all organizations that work on this topic. We are the ugly stepchild of most foundations who don't pay attention or see the connection of this as a foundational issue and a root cause of a lot of the other topics that they fund. So I'll give an example, you know, education. We often go to foundations for funding, who fund education, and they come back and say, you know, no, like there's no connection between child sexual abuse and education, when clearly a child that is suffering from any type of abuse, but particularly sexual abuse, is unable to achieve the scholastic standards that we would hope that they would be able to achieve. So we're still dealing with educating those who are trying to make the world a better place. I think we're also dealing with, as I think it was Donald, you said, this collective language and being able to make sure that people who are advocating for this are speaking in the same way so that the general public understands what we're talking about, versus one organization sort of framing it this way, another organization framing it another way, and the general public being a little bit confused. Is it child sexual abuse? Is it child safeguarding? Are we talking about sexual violence? You know, is it all the same thing? And so a common language for me is an important part.
Thanks. Why don't we head over to you, Pooja? You disappeared for a little. I'm glad to see you back there.
Two big challenges that I continue to see. I think one over the years is just going from a very comprehensive model into a model that is more bite-sized for people to take on. What we realized is that even when we came up with a 6-lesson plan model for schools to adopt, there has been a bit of resistance over a period of time to even take that. And so now we have an abridged version of the 6-lesson plan model, which is a 2-lesson plan model. And then we've come up with digital courses, which is 40 minutes. And so I think we've had to sort of adapt our ways. We've been pushed to adapt our ways to be able to put our foot in the door in spaces just to get some information, some knowledge, some skills out there, because it's really important that people at least recognize, both children and adults, that this is happening. These are some solutions. This is what you could do. And be able to even report and seek help. I think because for a child to seek help and get some support and help if abuse is happening is very, very critical. And so I think somewhere along the journey, this challenge of having to continuously innovate, create, be agile has taken a toll on the organization, because there's a lot of innovation that you've had to do. And then continuously testing the efficacy of how that works, because you can't come up with a smaller version and then not know whether it's effective or not, right? So I think the continuous resource development and content management, I would say, is one big thing. But, you know, we've had to do it. The second piece I would say is, I completely agree with Caitlin on the resources. I think the kind of financial resources that are required to operate at scale is something completely different. And for a country like India, where we have only 400 million children, for us to even imagine how do you take on such programs and take it, of course, you know, the governments at the national level are taking it up. At the state level, we're seeing some traction. So I'm very excited about that. But I recognize that doing this at scale and the kind of resources that we need is something completely different altogether. And I do believe that, you know, we need more of those resources. And the solutions that I see is that, one, learning from the first one, that, you know, it's okay to not hold on to your model not hold on to that, it should be done this way and no other way, but learning to be agile and innovative, just to be able to put your foot into the door and get into spaces, as many spaces as possible, just to talk about the issue of child sexual abuse. So the solution to that is, to the first one is that is the way I see it. And the second one, I just think we all need to keep advocating with corporations, grant giving organizations, HNIs, bringing this issue in their cognizance and showing them that, look, these are solutions and it works. Because what I found is that people, when they see solutions, some of them who are sector agnostic, when they see solutions and when they see an organization that has the capability to execute on it, they are willing to put the money. It's just that we need more doors to open to be able to go and talk about the work that all of us are doing, so that we can get that support. And very often I just go meet people just to talk about the issue, not to raise money for Arpan, just to highlight the issue of child sexual abuse, because it just doesn't get spoken about, right? The most important sectors that get all the attention is education, health, livelihoods, and child protection is just nowhere. And so I sometimes just take opportunities that I get just to talk about the issue of child protection. So I do believe that a lot more advocacy and conversations need to be done to get more attention, so that we can drive more investment on the issue. And not to say anti-trafficking is getting a lot of that attention and the funding. And very often I have those conversations to say, hey, can we, anti-trafficking work is important. There's no two ways about it. But can anybody imagine the amount of incest happening in the world? And are we all right with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really powerful.
Could I be next? Unless Pooja, do you want? Because I want to build on that, and also on Donald's comments about we all need to speak the same way, and we need to have this global understanding. And yeah, we need to have a global understanding, but we need to, you think globally, but you act locally. And in my experience, there are two biggest challenges. One is the homosexuality issue, which I will get to, but the other is we've been forced, the Western theories have been forced down our throats, okay? And I have specifically have felt this because I was that Western theorist coming into the Philippines and saying the research says this, and I got a lot of resistance. And now I am part of the resistance because I understand what they're saying. The language is different. How can we speak the same way when even if you all spoke English, we use English in a different way. And I was in a conference recently where there were some Indian researchers, and they stood up in a plenary and they said, why do we have to use your language in research? Why do we have to explain everything to you? Why can't you come to us and use our language? And that makes a huge difference how we work with our children and how we understand their experience, because their experience as an Indian, their experience as a Filipino is very different, very different. And for a Westerner, I mean, I grew up with missionaries. My parents were missionaries. And so I saw my parents often struggling with this. They were the one white people in this village, and everyone looked up to them and they knew everything. And they worked really hard to maintain their humility with this and to recognize that they didn't know and they had to learn. And when I go back to my hometown, I get these, my father was a Muslim scholar, Islamic scholar. So he read the Quran and he spoke Urdu. And I would get these Muslims coming to me and say, you know what, your father understood us, and so we would listen to him. And whereas I have others, missionaries who they were, we're from the West, we know better than you. And lots of Christians who would come to me and say, well, yeah, we became Christians because of the money. We want to be like you for wealth. So this trying to maintain, I get upset when we see so many Westerners coming. I mean, there are good ones. Donald's a good one. I don't know about everyone else, but this is how we do it. This is what we've learned. And how can what we've learned help you to understand what is happening to you? And then you come and we will listen with your language. But the West isn't learning their language. Okay, it's not learning their language, and you're still coming in and saying, this is what sex abuse looks like. This is what causes it. And while there are frameworks, to understand some of the dynamics and the characteristics, those are still different. Okay, they're the same, but different. So, being part of the solution, we all have to be part of the solution, but the how has to be at the very grassroots. And I can look at what my colleagues in my village, my town, now it's a city, India has grown so quickly, and how they're handling it. And I can say, no, that's wrong. But it's not wrong. It's how they do it. And that's the message I want to get out to everyone. We have to look at the grassroots, and we have to start thinking bottom up rather than top down. And we're looking top down because that's where all the research is. And I still get upset with my Filipino professional colleagues because they do research and they want it printed in the international journals. Okay, and the international journals are expensive. And do the international journals really care about it? Whereas we're the ones who need that research. Okay, we're happy to listen to you, but then you have to listen to us and speak our language.
Lois, I think that's such a good point. And I think it speaks to this deeper issue that goes beyond child sexual abuse, which is really this idea of colonization and, how international development has happened over the last several decades. And it's so important, right? Because it's about it's this balance. And I see it also in the violence against women field, this balance between kind of human rights and thinking about things globally, but then what you just said, like you can think about it that way, but the solutions, the implementation, the way it's done has to be led by local leaders who understand the way the problem happens and the way these solutions can come together. And so I think investing in supporting local researchers, leaders, and the people at the front lines really doing that work is essential. And we haven't seen that. We haven't in the way that it needs to happen, I think, as part of a bigger global community.
Let me give you a very, very simple example. Okay.
And then I want to hear from Donald for a second, but go ahead.
Sorry, let's do Donald and then I'll give my simple example.
Yes. Let's just go around to Donald for a second. I said, we're all so passionate about this. I knew this was going to be a good conversation. And part of my job is just to make sure we get everyone a chance. Go ahead, Donald.
Look, I could list a whole raft of challenges that I would see. One of them, I would say, is recognition of the scale of the problem and the rather naive assumption that we can achieve the change necessary using our criminal justice systems on their own. I will go to conferences that will tell me if we just increase sentencing, our police are the solution. We just arrest, we get children to report, we get reports listened to by the police, we get people in the courts, we lock them up, and then therefore the solution is there. I would tell you in the UK right now that our police have invested millions and millions of pounds in arresting and doing a very effective job arresting 9,000 online offenders every year. I think the UK police probably doing as good, if not a better job by scale of a nation than anyone in the world. But we're arresting 9,000 people. The UK police would say when they look online, they see 300,000 people viewing sexual images of children. So we can arrest 9,000 and we can arrest the next 9,000 and the next 9,000. And how long will it take us to get to the 300,000 people doing it? So we have to move, I believe we have to punish perpetrators. I'm not excusing any behavior that causes harm to another human being. But we also have to have solutions that are much more promising and positive and at scale than that. And therefore, we have to have an imagination as to what those solutions look like, because our politicians will be keen on something that looks like a police officer's got the answer. and our newspapers will want to have the drama of the arrest and the courtroom and the sentence. The trouble is, we often don't need the drama to bring a solution to this problem at scale. So that for me is one of the big deal things. We have to look at the scale of the problem in the face, recognize what it is, and then realize how many more solutions we need that don't just involve a police officer, a politician, a law, and a criminal court. And I say that clearly working with those who offend, and we're creating some online solutions right now where we're getting 200,000 people viewing a self-help site for people with a problem with what they're doing online. That's not a small number. I mean, getting one person to stop offending is a good story. Getting anywhere close to up 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, we have some new solutions, but we have to have the imagination, and we have to also then be allowed to play those solutions forward. And if politicians have the way too often, the votes are in being punitive, being dramatic, and that's not necessarily what will serve the best needs of children or indeed of women.
Well, let's continue a little bit down that line, because I know we've heard a lot about what the problems are, but maybe let's stay with you, Donald. And then I know you also want to make a comment, Lois, but just to go with the...
No, I don't need to make the comment.
You're good. Transitioning to solutions, because I feel like when we talk about the problems, there's so much. We could spend like 5 hours talking about that. But I think it would be good to begin to think through, well, what do we do about those challenges? What are those solutions? And you started to address a couple of them, Donald. I wonder if you could take us to the next step. What do you see as the key solutions to some of the challenges that have been identified?
Look, there is one of the challenges I should have mentioned, and really needs to be part of our conversation, is the changing face of the internet and what the internet is doing to the problem of child sexual abuse. Because we kind of got used to what child sexual abuse was, the internet comes along and it delivers a raft of new problems, new challenges. Yes, but it's also a means of new solutions as well. And it is in that space that as I say, the UK National Crime Agency would say they would see 300,000 people viewing child sexual abuse material online in the UK. And a proportion of those people will be sexually grooming children, and some of them will be sexually grooming, live streaming images from the Philippines, from India, from South America. So we have to put the solutions in those places as well, and that involves getting industry on board, and working with Google, working with Microsoft, with all the big industry players, and make sure that they use their insights, their wisdom, yes, their dollars. And they mostly are going to be dollars rather than pounds or whatever other currencies. They have to use their money to do the best they can to design the internet with some solutions kind of built into it, recognizing that it can be a force for bad as well as a force for good. So how do we motivate to create those better solutions, knowing that the internet certainly is driving lots of new problems, including the new problems that we're having in the UK with young people getting their sex education online, and therefore behaving sexually very badly with each other all too often, and then exchanging images or blackmailing each other or humiliating each other. So all sorts of bad things going on, but we can bring the solutions to those places as well with some wisdom, and not pretend that, again, the criminal justice solution is the only show in town, because it isn't. But it's an important one. I'm not dishing criminal justice. These are important things, having criminal laws, marking a boundary. But I would finally just kind of say this. I was at a We Protect Global Alliance conference last year, and the platform speakers over 2.5 days, government spokespeople and big industry players were telling the audience of people from 50, 60 nations of the world about the problems and the solutions. And the problems and the solutions they were presenting were about, yes, big tech doing better things. So tech for good somehow being designed to be the solutions. But they were also talking very articulately about what children and their parents need to know to be safe online, and so the parents help their kids be safe online. These are desperately important things, and don't discredit them in any way. But over 2.5 days of all these fine speakers, not a single person mentioned, how do you get the perpetrator to stop? Because we have this problem because people do bad things. How do we get the person that might do the bad thing to stop? Or how do we get them to not start in the first place? We have to have those solutions to the people that do the harm. And that's what I think we have to invest a lot of energy in. Because if we can reduce their numbers or eradicate their numbers, we don't have the problem. And I just think that's a goal we have to shoot for every day of our lives. And that's certainly partly what Stop It Now in the UK is doing, and other Stop It Now projects and others across the globe are doing to help perpetrators stop their abusive behaviors.
Thank you, Donald, and such great points. And I'm actually reminded of the work that we're seeing in a lot of different countries around, starting to work with perpetrators younger and younger, including those who haven't yet perpetrated and have thoughts or desires, and the idea of how do you help people early on in that process versus waiting until something terrible has happened. So excellent points. I'm going to open it up. Who else would like to jump in with some good solutions here?
For me, I think going back to Lois's point that you have to speak into a community's listening, creating day-to-day contact with individuals so that they can help change their behavior is an incredibly important part of what we're doing at Darkness to Light here in the US. Similar to Pooja, we have had a train the trainer model where we teach adults. We've trained 2 million adults in the US and in 70 other countries. But the reality is, when people take that training, they feel really safe in that space, in that room, when they've taken the training with those other adults, and they feel empowered and they feel like they're ready to go and save all of the children in the world. And then they walk back out into this big bad world with lots of stigma and lots of shame around having these conversations. And they sort of recoil back into their previous behavior of allowing that shame and stigma and societal pressure to not, to stop them from asking the questions or, being vocal about something that they wanted. And so for us, we're trying, we're having conversations with a lot of different communities in the United States to hear what are some of the biggest issues and barriers and vulnerabilities in your community, and how can we build an app which allows you to sort of associate with this topic every day. And so we're still in the process of building that app, but we're hoping that once people have some of that education that Donald was talking about, that parental caregiver education, that they're then going to be able to connect that to their calendar and have constant, sort of reminders like show up early for so-and-so's soccer practice, be unpredictable as a parent, like some of the preventive behaviors that we can work with. And the other thing, I think, just to sort of give a shout out to Dr. Letourneau at Johns Hopkins, she's also doing some of that, preventive work for those who are trying to hurt children. And she's starting that at I think it's the 6th grade level, and she's testing that in the Baltimore school districts. And I think that it's incredibly important, Donald, and I don't want you to be the lone soldier out there talking about primary prevention work, even though Darkness, like, that's not our primary function, we cannot do our work without the work that Stop It Now is doing. And so I just want to second what you're saying in terms of it's got to be all of those pieces together. And I find that work to be just as important, if not more important some days than what we're doing.
Yeah, if I could also piggyback on that. Sorry, was someone else? Pooja, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Lois. I'll go after you.
Okay. I just want to piggyback on Donald and Caitlin, because for a long time we've been talking about what the real protection is, preventing a person from becoming an offender, and what is the progression, and we're trying to understand that in our research. And of course, there's nothing here specific, that, but a part of what our issue also in the Philippines is that we're actually a historically matriarchal culture. So we get often these, well, this is patriarchal culture and therefore the problem is patriarchy. and this is how you have to think of things. So, but our matriarchal culture is very, very strong, which has our girls with this girl power becoming very aggressive. Okay, and when we look at the research on the experiences of our boys and our girls, there's a lot of psychological abuse. And we have to look at who is the aggressor in the psychological abuse, because a lot of it is girls. Okay, so what is the effect of this girl aggression onto a boy who is then supposed to behave like a man? So these are some of the things way in the back. Why I'm just throwing this out, okay? I kind of lost my train of thought. But why is it because we want to look at the real prevention. What creates this, as Donald says? What creates this behavior? And we do have to look at ourselves and how we're working with boys, but we also have to teach our girls how to behave, because we have a lot of aggressive girls who are part of the problem, but because they're always the victim. Anyway, that's one thing I think that we can learn from the Philippines is this positive, this blending of matriarchy and patriarchy when we work with boys and girls with gender.
Well, I think it's such a good point, Lois, around gender dynamics. I mean, really understanding that. And, you know, again, every country is different, every community is different, and you see different dynamics showing up. I mean, one of the things that we've looked at through our data over the years is actually, you know, this assumption that only men perpetrate sexual abuse is inaccurate. You know, women also perpetrate. And what are those dynamics like? And so really looking at, you know, the sex and gender of the victim, of the perpetrator, the dynamics that are happening. And in every country, they're different and it looks different. And really understanding, I think what you're getting is drivers really becomes critical. And that's what I also heard you talk about, Caitlin and Donald, around, you know, what are some of the drivers? And you have individual behaviors, but they're embedded in a broader community that has norms and assumptions. And how do you work across that? Pooja.
I just want to make a point around, actually 2 points. One around that, you know, as much as we think that we, you know, I think it's important definitely to work with offenders and young offenders, and Arpan works with them as well. But what I've found is it's very limited. The minute one of their any objective is met, so we do therapy with them. As soon as, you know, a milestone is met, the motivation of the children, the adolescents, the motivation of the families just goes down to continue with therapy and sustain this over a period of time. And we've done this in various groups, and we've still not been able to come up with a solution on how do you keep that keep sustaining those groups so that we can continuously do therapy where it reaches a point where we need to. I think one is that challenge. The second, I just wanted to button on the whole online piece and the online safety piece. What I am finding is internationally, a lot of investment again is going towards online prevention, online safety, big grants going to that. And in my mind, I have a question. Is that the easy way out?
Yes.
Are we denying and are we sort of hiding away from the fundamental grassroots work that is required? And I find, and this is what I am thinking, that, you know, funding online prevention work has become the new norm, maybe because it's easy, you're able to track data, all of those things. But are we forgetting the important offline work that we need to do? Because in my experience and in my understanding, you can only work online in an offline manner. And we see that in our schools, in our work with children and adults on a daily basis. You know, just to give you an example, we went into a classroom, our personal safety lesson plans going on. With adolescents, we talk about internet safety. And we said, it's not safe for you to make friends with unknown people. The next day, the 7th grade child came up and said, look, I unfriended 400 people because I just made them friends. I've only kept 4 friends and the others I've unfriended. And I just thought that's a fantastic example of actually doing online safety work offline. And so I just find that this whole investment that's going towards online safety is like, what are we really trying to do? You know, just my two thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting, Pooja, because I think one of the things, and you mentioned Elizabeth Latourneau before Caitlin. I'm thinking now of David Finkelhor in the U.S., and really more and more research showing that connectivity and that connection between online and offline. In some ways, some of these divides are artificial in nature, because there's so much that's happening for children. Their experience online and offline is sometimes one and the same. Anyway, there's a lot to unpack there. I think it's really important to think through that. One question I have for the panel is, a lot of you raised the idea of resources. I mean, at the end of the day, the amount of funding, energy, and attention that's going to this issue is woefully inadequate anywhere. And so, some of you were talking about like raising awareness, raising solutions. But one of the things I found is that in my work, I remember being in a position once in government or in a place where, you're kind of decision makers, they need to understand the problem, they need to understand solutions, but they need people pounding on their door saying, it's not okay not to do anything about this. I'm just wondering, do you have a sense of what it would take to actually push, whether it's tech, whether it's governments, whether it's communities, to really pay the attention and put the resources behind this issue that are needed? I mean, do you guys have thoughts on that?
I just want to share one experience when I was working in Malaysia and Mahathir was PM, and they just did not want to look at the issue of child sex abuse. It didn't happen. Muslims don't do it, et cetera, et cetera. So in a group, in a conference with Christians, okay, you always have the jabum, you have the prayer. And so one woman said in jest, we should pray that Mahathir's child is sexually abused because then he will pay attention. And that's a horror, and it was in jest, but on the other hand, this is, how do we get them to realize that it's almost like it has to happen to them, although, Trump got COVID and he didn't do anything about it. So how do we get them? I'm just, sorry, piggybacking on you with that horrible example of praying for Mahathir's child to be sexually abused so that Malaysia can move forward.
Take that. Having been through it myself, I don't wish it on anyone, but okay, but there's the issue of, getting close to the experience, I think is what you're saying, Lois.
Yeah.
Others?
Daniela, I think we have to find out what the motivating factors are for the sector that we're talking to. So if you look at the socio-ecological model, like what are the motivating driving factors for each level of the socio-ecological model to adopt prevention behaviors? So if you're looking at the most outer ring, which is that like political, social influence, why would celebrities post about it? Why would government officials, produce legislation and pass legislation? Why would philanthropists donate, hundreds of millions of dollars towards this topic? I know we have to take away as practitioners the fact that we just want people to do something because it's morally and ethically the best thing to do to solve this, and we all know that. We have to understand that people are human and that they have competing priorities and motivating factors. So how do we make this topic one of the most important topics in those particular sectors and get people to act? And until we collectively do that in our own specific countries, and I'm not saying, or at some of these sort of organized international bodies like the UN, et cetera, until we do that and understand how to speak differently about this to get people to act in that way and connect it, I don't think we're going to see a huge change because this is such a stigmatized topic. Anything that has to do with sex is stigmatized. STDs, HIV, child sexual abuse, rape, all of those things tied to sex are incredibly stigmatized. So one of the things that we do, for instance, youth serving organizations are a microcosm. They don't ever want to admit that something has happened there because then kids won't come to their youth serving activities. And so we find access to the risk mitigation individuals. And sometimes their motivation is not keeping kids safe, it's keeping the reputation of the organization pristine. And that's okay. Like, we need to be okay with the fact that not everyone has the same motivating factors and create campaigns which then support their motivation. And so if we can do that a little bit more, I think we would be able to scale and go back and find more resources because the motivation is there to make the resources available.
Can I make a few kind of comments on this area? Because I think how do we get the funds? How do we get the issue taken seriously by a range of people? Look, I mean, my strongest kind of commitment is that members of the public, in a way, and that doesn't necessarily take lots of dollars. Members of the public, parents, carers, neighbours, that they take the issue seriously, because it's the small things that all those ordinary citizens can do that can make a difference here if they choose to be interested, to bother to find out a bit about it, about the danger signs, about the things that the steps they can take, about how they keep their kids safe, how they educate their children well, so that they're reduced vulnerability to victimization or indeed offending behavior going forward. So I would like to make sure resource goes to that place. But of course, politicians will argue for prison places and for criminal justice proceedings. All the UK pounds, shed loads of money goes towards prosecuting a few. And we've seen our Children's Commission has showed in 1 year a suggestion that over a period of time, about 400,000 children experienced sexual abuse. Of that, 6,000 perpetrators got convicted. And that's where the money's gone on all that for that 6,000. We ought to start with the 4,000 and say, what do those 4,000 need, and what's best for them, and then craft our solutions around those bigger numbers. And I think our politicians need to listen to that, and there needs to be some very strong voices that actually that speak to them eloquently. And I do think the more this issue is in the public domain, the more people are speaking up, the more victims are coming forward, and survivors of childhood abuse in their adult years are coming forward. And I think that's making a difference to what the pounds and the dollars being put on the table. In December of this year, the UK government will have its first ever child sexual abuse prevention strategy. We never had one of those before, but this year we will have one. And it's been because of the clamouring of individual strong voices, but also the scale of the problem, and children's charities beating on the government's door saying this is a problem and it costs you money to actually solve the problem. Well, why don't you prevent it? And then all that money can be spent preventative rather than on the solution after the fact. So I think there is hope, but every nation has to find its own way forward and its own economies that will bring some solutions to the table. Then we can learn from each other. I mean, what's happening in the States comes over to us. What's happening in Canada comes over, and we learn those lessons too. And we're importing your solutions, and the solutions from India are coming to the UK now as well. So we share, and I think that's one way we can reduce the cost for everybody.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Donald.
Jump on that. Sorry, Daniela, go ahead.
Oh, I said Pooja. Yeah, I was calling on you.
I so agree with Donald that, we need to raise our voices so that the government pays attention. I'm very pleased to share that, personal safety education has become a part of national life skills curriculum in India. And under a joint initiative between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health, we've launched this program, and we've just finished training the state resource group across all states and union territories of India. And I'm hoping this reaches the 260 million children it is envisaged to reach. So it's really exciting that when we all come together, what is the change that we can drive? But on a humorous note, I wanted to say one more thing. So I'm going to show you something. And I was just wondering if we all can do this, is create an SDG 18 called child protection, so that it's not buried under 16.2 of the SDG goals, but we have a separate SDG goal for child protection. So yeah, I just think that it needs that importance of becoming a global agenda out there in big words and letters.
Yeah, I will say, Pooja, having been in the beast of the belly as these SDGs were being developed, there was a huge push for actually having one just on child protection. And unfortunately, it failed because the voices weren't loud enough. So I think it takes us back to this idea of voices that all of you are raising and being loud. And I do think, a couple of you mentioned this, but I do think part of that needs to be kind of the allies, the friends, the family, the survivors, everyone kind of coming forward around this issue, breaking the silence, and taking responsibility in our own communities to get that. And congratulations, Donald. I didn't realize that was happening in the UK. That's pretty amazing. And it turns out that the UK, there's this index that ranks countries that the Economist Intelligence Unit did called Out of the Shadows. And the UK is #1, even though their score is something like 68%. So, there's still a lot of room to grow for everyone, but it seems to be doing quite a bit. Okay, at this point, I'm going to transition over to questions from the audience. And there are many, many questions, but I do want to start to get to some of these. There are a couple of questions that are focused on sharing resources. I think, Pooja, perhaps the best way to do those is to actually, as a follow-up from the webinar, we could think of a few resources to share with the community at large throughout, based on all the comments that were made. There were several resources that were raised.
We have the website handy of all the organizations. The tech team, I'd request you to put that up for everybody to see. So we've got all our websites out there, the URLs. So yes, and send an email out as well.
There are a couple of questions. I'm looking through this that have to do with norms and culture. For example, there's a question about how do we address rape culture, the root causes of child sexual abuse. What are the kinds of things we do around prevention at large with communities? I'm trying to summarize just a few of those, but I think it goes to the point, the discussion around, and Pooja, you mentioned this at the end. We've been really thinking and working on this framework of prevention, healing, and justice. I think it's a framework that a lot of people use where, Donald, you were showcasing the fact that justice is not the answer. It has to be part of it, but it's not all there is. There's also the healing component, which is really important for both victims and perpetrators, as well as prevention. And so I'm wondering if we could speak a little bit more to this idea of prevention and norms and culture, because there are several questions related to that. What do you all think are some of the ways in which we address kind of norms, culture, and prevention in a way that's better than what we've done so far?
I can jump in. We're speaking to an international audience. You may or may not know the US struggles very deeply with race issues. Most recently, the death of George Floyd, which was an 8-minute video of a gentleman being suffocated by a police officer. And it sort of sent the entire country, as we were all sort of sitting in place in COVID, into a state of deep reflection. Many people already acknowledged and have seen those race issues, and others sort of were able to sit for the first time and really understand and think through, their participation, willing or not, in the systemic racism that we see in this country. And so there's been a lot of conversations about defunding the police, and not just the police, but how do the institutions that we have established to protect children, to protect women, to protect whoever, have themes of racism throughout the implementation strategy. And so one of the things that the child safeguarding community has sort of discussed here in the United States is how do we reallocate some of the money from the police force to a better system to help children from vulnerable populations. So we're not just talking about the Black community here. We would talk about the Hispanic and Latinx community. Many of them are dealing, they're undocumented immigrants, and so they're scared to report because they're scared to be deported. We're talking about the LGBTQIA community, and them being ostracized from their families at some time, being homeless, having to deal with the power dynamic of older individuals taking them in. So how do we build an equitable structure to take care of, the vulnerable populations that we see in our country? And I don't think we have the answer yet. But I do think that there is a growing voice in the child protection community on how to reassess where that money is being allocated and what are the resources and the education to the providers to be able to be better equipped to handle conversations with those vulnerable populations.
Great. Does someone else want to jump in on that? Otherwise, I'm going to move to a couple of other questions.
Can I just acknowledge something that's, I think with regard to, there needs to be conversations with children from very early age in appropriate developmental ways, in language that we can share with them. There's a charity here in the UK called the NSPCC, the National Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. They created, must be 3 or 4 years ago, a phenomenal film resource for kids called Pantosaurus. And it's a singing dinosaur that's all about what's in my pants belongs to me. And it's a way of engaging 5 and 6 year olds in just being clear they have rights, that their private parts are theirs, and that other people aren't entitled to touch them. It's something to share with their peers, their parents, their teachers, so that no one's embarrassed about this awkward thing that we worry about, this sex thing, because it's a fun, animated story about privacy, respectfulness. And if we can teach kids from 5, 6 about these things, particularly teaching boys about respectful relationships, because I think that's where we've got to bring some solutions, because we know globally the biggest problem of child sexual abuse perpetration is male. And we have to help males just understand about respectful relationships, about consent, starting early on in their lives, in non-threatening, non-worrying ways, and then building on that conversation over the years. And Pooja, like you are doing in India, I'm delighted that our UK government has agreed that every public school across England has to deliver relationships and sex education from primary school through to 16. That every school.
Hey, congratulations! That's fantastic news.
With the national curriculum. So it was important to get it there because it is not. Where do we learn about respectfulness? And we learn hopefully a lot of that in families. But kids also need to be shared it, and it needs to be talked about. And families often avoid talking about it. So let's put it on a formal agenda, and then the norms that should flow from some of that. Trouble is, we've got this menace of the internet that might be offering alternative versions of norms, which we also have to combat. But Pooja, your point about are we finding easy solutions in the online safety world and avoiding dealing with child sexual abuse in the offline world? I absolutely agree that is a real challenge that we can push to see a problem in one place, which means we're neglecting the other problems. So we have to see everything in the round, which doesn't mean neglect online safety, but it needs to be part of a broader kind of solution to do with respectful relationships, consent.
Actually, Donald, that takes me to my next question, which is from someone around kind of the connections between this and Me Too, and the fact that, someone had raised, Caitlin, you had raised Me Too before. There's a question about, will there finally be, additional dialogue around these issues? Because it really has to do with thinking about some of this more comprehensively. So, and you've started to touch on this, Donald, with issues of consent, et cetera. Does anyone else want to take that question around Me Too and the opportunities for kind of elevating the issue of child sexual abuse with what's happening there?
I just wanted to share that, you know, like here, Donald, in UK, they finally have this law, and in the United States, in my state of Washington, they only just now have a Senate bill that mandates comprehensive sexual health education, which includes respect from this year, it'll be for high school, and from next year, it'll be forward. And I look at these two examples of England and America, and I think about how often I've heard in India and the Philippines, but, oh, you guys are so ahead of us. Oh, you don't have a problem talking about sex. You know, we do. And this is when we can really start learning from India and the Philippines, because we have a mandate also for personal safety. Which includes, you know, a little bit of sex, but it includes the pantaloons. But no, what was it, Donald?
Pantaloons.
Pantaloons. Yeah, I love that. You know, so
you like to dance to
yeah,
it?
yeah. in Tagalog. But you know, this is just trying to throw out an example of how we can learn from. Now I'm saying we as a Westerner, how we can learn from Asia, rather than we always pushing ourselves down the throat of Asia.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Daniela, I think the Me Too movement, listen, there's a place for adult sexual assault to be the focus of a movement. But I think there was a question from Rosalia around the connection between child sexual abuse and sexual assault. And yes, there is a statistical connection between the vulnerabilities created and a lack of boundaries that some survivors feel from their childhood experience that does put them in situations where their boundaries are violated again as adults. And so we have to acknowledge that there's that connection, because again, if you just focus on sexual assault and you don't look at some of the root causes of why some of those things happen, then you're not solving the problem at its root cause. Now, that's not to say that all cases of sexual assault are connected with child sexual abuse. That's not true. But I do think that it's important that movements speak to each other and understand the nuances and build on the collective energy forward in order for all people to be brought to a place of safety and comfort.
Right, and this idea, I think that's so important around, and we've talked a lot about today, kind of root causes, what are the drivers, and how in different communities those might look different, understanding those, and then responding to those. And in many cases, there are some commonalities we know between sexual violence against adults and children. And so how do we make sense of that? Yeah. There's another question here I want to highlight, which is a question about, and there are actually a couple, but specifically around the role of the education sector and how can teachers contribute to raising awareness towards preventing and responding to child sexual abuse. I wonder if someone wants to take that.
Yeah, sure, I could take that. I think, you know, schools or groups of schools, government schools, private, public-private, whatever the partnership, I think schools must take putting up a child protection policy very seriously. At least in India, the Supreme Court has mandated that every organization that works with children needs to have a child protection policy in place, which I think is a great move, but the execution to happen. So I think just having that in place is important. Training the staff is really critical so that teachers are able to pick up signs and symptoms. Teachers are able to teach personal safety education to children, enable disclosures, and help children. Teachers are with children for most of the day than actually even family members. So I think the role of the educator is very critical in this. And Arpan's been working hard over the years to push and mainstream child protection and child sexual abuse prevention within the education streams, because I think that that is a place where we'll be able to provide the information, build the knowledge and skills in a very structured environment, and also enable support when a disclosure happens. Of course, keeping confidentiality in mind, because that is really important as well. And so I feel that educators can play a very key role in doing that.
Great. Anyone else want to say something about that? Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
I agree with Pooja. But I just want to add one thing, and that is remembering that teachers are also the number two offenders. Parents and then teachers are the number two offenders, and most children experience all sides of kind of psychological abuse even in the schools. And my colleagues in Ghana have told me that since COVID, the number of abuse cases have gone way down because there's no school. So their number one offenders are in school. So as Pooja knows, you have to really work with the teachers and train the teachers as much as the teachers training the, you know.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Lois, you know, in fact, talk about specificity in countries. One of the things we found through our research is that actually in some countries, teachers are among the top 3 perpetrators. In some, it's different. And so, you know, in Central America, for example, the number one perpetrator of sexual violence against girls is a family member. And for boys, it's a friend. But you go to another country and it changes. So I think it's also really important not to assume that every country looks the same in terms of what's happening in schools, and really be guided by some of the data. But in fact, over and over again, we see that there are, you know, of course, teachers that perpetrate sexual violence and abuse, and that's important. I do want to flag, though, one of the things that I heard in the answers is really this idea of there's a role for the curriculum and what kids learn about themselves, their bodies, how they relate to other children. Then there's this issue around how does the school system respond to this, and then the role of educators. So it's really, when you're talking about schools, I heard a couple of different things. And, you know, Caitlin, you work with training adults who interact with children in schools. But one of the things we found in our, you know, evidence review last year of what works to prevent sexual violence against children around the world, those 3 components are really important. The things you teach kids, what you do with the system as a whole, and then those adults that interact with the children. And thinking about those 3 pieces within the school then becomes, I think, important. And I heard each one of you say a little bit of it. So I was just trying to bring it together there.
And just want to point one part. A lot of countries use school-based prevention programs, but don't work with parents. In India, we find that working with parents is absolutely critical for child protection. You can't work in isolation of just running a curriculum in school or just training a teacher. Making families aware and giving them skills and giving them the knowledge on how can they protect children from sexual abuse or recognize signs and symptoms, and all of those pieces. I won't get into too much detail, but I feel that the parents and the family play a very key role in the prevention of child sexual abuse. And we must recognize them as very important stakeholders and make it a part of our school program.
Yeah, and just to build on this, because one of the things I was hearing in India was we learn all these things, and the Philippines, we learn all these things in school, but our parents don't know it. And so the churches have come forward and are teaching the parents, and then you build this biblical base. And of course, each country uses the Bible in a different way. So there are lots of ways to teach the parents, but yes, from the school is important.
Right, and the school becomes, in a way, I think it's a great point, like an entry point to reach families, right? And parents,
yes,
which is important. Oh my gosh, I feel like we could take many more questions, but we are running out of time. So I want to go ahead and just acknowledge all the amazing questions. I was trying to summarize so we could answer several at once. And I do want to make sure we end on time. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to each of the panelists and ask them if there's one key message you want to leave the audience with at this point. What is that message? And who wants to go first?
I'll go first, 2 seconds. Focus on your boys. This whole psychosocial, cultural aspect of working with boys.
Okay, I'll go next then. I'm a big fan of models to help me understand and see a problem. with a structure around it. So whether it's David Finkelhauer's 4 preconditions to child sexual abuse or the public health model of prevention, but there's a third one I'd like to just introduce, which is Paul Eck's Crime Triangle, ECK, X Crime Triangle. It's about crime. It's not just about child sexual abuse. And it says for any crime, you have to have 3 essential things. You need to have a vulnerable victim, you need to have a willing offender, and you need to have a place where it happens. You remove any of those things and the crime doesn't happen. Now, they surrounded that triangle with other people, like the parents that would help keep the child safe so the child's less vulnerable, or the adult that will keep the perpetrator from being a perpetrator, or the place manager that can reduce opportunities in a place. But it's a reminder that there's a discipline to the things we can do that prevent child sexual abuse. And please, let's not forget, we can work with offenders or potential offenders so they don't do the harm that we're trying to get them not to do.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go next. I think we really need to continue to innovate in this sector. And by innovating, we will address some of these root causes, and we need to understand what people's motivations are. It's what we've done to solve, other public health crises. And if we apply the same sort of rhetoric and vigilance and resources, that we will be able to do great things for kids. But on an individual level, I think it's always just important for those who watch this and in perpetuity to know that it is preventable, and you have a role to play in that prevention. And if you are a survivor and you haven't sought out treatment yet, or you haven't disclosed, there are communities out there who are ready and willing to listen, and you should feel as if you're not alone and what happened to you wasn't your fault.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Okay, I'll go next. Very simple. Prevention is possible, healing is possible, and we can stop child sexual abuse. All it needs is the will to do this. And while the issue might look daunting, complex, sensitive, chuck it. Just go do what it needs to do, because the power of collective action is tremendous. And I feel that as professionals connected to the sector of development or not, or as teachers or educators, as parents, we all have a role to play in this. The onus of protection is not on children. Children can only participate in their safety. The onus of protection is on us adults.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Awesome, just reminders for all of us as we go forward. And to close us out, just a couple of thoughts. I'm not going to try to summarize the conversation. It was just really insightful and exciting to have the conversation. I do want to pick up on this issue of kind of speaking out on the issue. As a survivor myself, I made the decision a long time ago, over a decade ago, to start telling my own story publicly as a survivor, because the silence around this issue was really deafening. And I think this idea of raising our voices, breaking the silence is essential. And that should not just be on survivors.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a survivor, there is help, there is a community. And if you want to, speak publicly, there are ways to do that. But the breaking the silence needs to be on everyone, and especially on the adults that have responsibility, as you said, Pooja, with children. I keep being reminded of what Malala, the Nobel Prize winner, Malala Yousafzai, said, that, when the whole world is silent, even a single voice can become really powerful. And so speak out, say something, ask tough questions, get training, find out more. We all have a role to play in breaking the silence and in creating change for all of those who have already experienced this, but more importantly, for the millions of children who haven't yet, and we want to protect in that new generation coming forward. Thank you so much for being with us. It was such an honor and a pleasure. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for wonderfully moderating this webinar, and really appreciate Arpan and Together for Girls coming together to do this, and so appreciate Kathleen, Lois, Donald for joining in, sharing your expertise with everybody. I think this has been a really energizing and enriching discussion. It's 10:30 in the night in India. I'm all awake. And I'm sure if there are participants from India, they are all awake as well. I'm like, okay, what do we do next? Go, go, go. So, so I think it was really, really nice. We have Child Safety Week going on, just letting all the participants know. Thank you for joining us. Join Child Safety Week. It's a movement that ARPAN has initiated to be amplifying voices on the issue of child sexual abuse. We've got 11 more webinars happening from the 17th to the 20th. I am sharing the link on the chat. Do check out all the webinars. Whatever is of interest to you, join. We've got topics from the criminal justice system to restorative justice being discussed, to primary prevention, to prevention and the role of educators, healing and trauma, and how do we look at those pieces, community-based prevention. So loads of topics being discussed. So do join in and be a part of Child Safety Week. Thank you so much. Good morning once again, and good afternoon and good evening to a lot of people, and good night to a lot of people at my side.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.